One of the issues that seems to be cropping up for a lot of students is simply thinking about problem solutions, sort of the problem-solving piece of this. Programming is a kind of a pure example of problem solving, and you really have to organize each step of the process in a very linear, logical fashion so that your result is what you expect it to be. And I'm not suggesting for a minute that this was easy. So I'm just going to talk about a few ideas that you might employ to help you with this process. The very first thing you really need to make sure is, can you explain what this program is supposed to do to another person? I mean, you may not have another person around, but you really need to try to explain it to yourself, if nothing else. And if you don't have a really clear idea of what exactly it is you're supposed to do with this program, you really shouldn't go any further. You need to get that clarification before you begin. Otherwise, you might just be chasing your tail for a long time. So really clearly understand what you're trying to do first. Next, and this is something that I know a lot of students won't ever do, but it's a really good idea, and it can certainly help cut down on the amount of time you might spend if you're having trouble with your programs. And that is, you should write down a step-by-step list of essentially instructions on what to do. It's very much like writing a complete recipe, or it's sort of like an instruction manual for somebody who's trying to do something. So you're trying to write down this list of steps or instructions on how to accomplish a particular task. Now, if you know very clearly what that task is, you should be able to write down step by step on how to accomplish that task. And don't worry about whether or not your syntax is perfect. You're trying to write this down sort of using your own language, using your own words to do this. And I would say it's going to be, mostly English kind of mixed in with a little bit of VBA. So do this first on paper. Don't do this sitting in front of a computer, because this will allow you to really clearly focus on the task at hand rather than worrying about the VBA and how to program this and how to program that. For example, if we're trying to convert the last name last comma first to a first last situation, here's just a series of steps that I've kind of written down. So the first thing we did was we copied the name, of course, from our sheet into a variable. We had to find the location of the comma and store that. Then we could use the left function to copy the left part of that name we grabbed from the sheet using our comma location variable. Then we could use the mid function to grab the right part, and we stored that. Again, we used the comma location variable. And then we had all the information we needed. We had the left part, the right part, we had the location of the comma, and we could put all of that onto the sheet just with assignment statements, and we could also concatenate the first name variable onto the last name variable and store that in the sheet. So it looks like we have a pretty good list of the steps here. And I think we could even ask somebody else to kind of walk through this list of steps and see if they thought it was reasonable, even if they didn't know much about Visual Basic. So you write down this list of steps and you check your list to see if you think you left anything out, and maybe you ask a friend to try it out and see what happens. And what you do is you kind of play computer. You actually store things into variables by simply writing them on a piece of paper and storing it in a little box maybe somewhere on a piece of paper. And you actually step by step through your list of steps, your instructions on how to accomplish this particular task. And you actually play computer, and I'm serious about that. You can create a bunch of variable names on a piece of paper just by writing their names and then putting the values below the names on your piece of paper. And you can go step by step by step through it, putting all the values onto your sheet of paper just like the computer's going to do with the computer's memory. And definitely walk through your program and see if it's going to work. And you're doing this before you're ever touching your keyboard. If it doesn't seem like it's going to work, you might have to go back to the first step and start over, or adjust your steps as necessary to make the program do what it's supposed to do. Again, did I say you're doing this before you touch your keyboard? So once you've got something you think works, now you need to convert that to VBA. So assignments are pretty easy. The if tests, that might not be quite as easy. Looping is a little bit harder. How do you get that loop structure to to work. Like in your steps, you wrote maybe something like go back up to the beginning and do this again. Well, that would be a looping structure. Maybe you have a statement in your list of steps that says do this 10 times. Well, that's a for loop structure. So you basically convert it to VBA and start typing it in. And a very important idea here is to not type in many lines of code before you check them and see if they work. So let's say you typed in 3 or 4 lines of code. You typed in those 3 or 4 lines of code, maybe 1 or 2 lines of code. You actually execute your program and it runs up to those 2 lines of code, let's say, runs through them. You could use F8 to step through those lines of code and see if it's doing exactly what you think it should be doing. Is it pulling the values off of the sheet into variables? Is it grabbing the left-hand part of a string and storing what you would expect it to be grabbing into a variable? And you can just look at your code and watch it execute. And again, don't do many lines of code before you actually run it and check it. 1 or 2 lines is really a good idea. 1 line of code, run it and see what happens with that 1 line of code you've added. This really cuts down on where things can go wrong. Because if you only add 1 line of code and it doesn't work, well, it's probably got to be in that 1 line of code. So if it's not working, you just have to start at the top, understand what every line of code is doing. You might have to hit the F8 key to actually execute that line of code and see what the result is in your variables. See what changed in your program. If your code is putting values out onto a sheet, go look at that sheet and see if the values showed up on the sheet in the location you expected them to be. Again, you need to understand what every line of code is doing, because if you don't understand what a particular line of code is doing, you're simply shooting in the dark. You can always put comments on every line of code, describing in a comment what you think it's doing, and then when you run it, compare your comment to what actually happens. And that F8 key for looking at your variables is invaluable. I cannot stress that enough. So these are just some ideas that you might use to actually help you write your code. Please keep the mail coming and let me know if you need some additional help.